Hi, my name's Ayesha and I'm back today with another property related video that hopefully is going to help you out on your property buying journey. So today's video is going to be all about the difference between leasehold and freehold, and it's just going to give you a little bit of information about the two. The reason why I'm doing this video is because I've seen lately quite a few different comments that are like, don't buy a leasehold, don't buy a leasehold, don't buy a leasehold. And like there was even one comment where this guy was like, anyone who buys a leasehold property is out of their minds. And I was really offended by that because I was like, well, I've bought a leasehold property. I don't think I'm out of my mind, and it definitely like worked for me in the short term. And so you have to be careful with like, you've got to weigh up pros and cons, and it's the same with anything in life. There are choices to be made and you've got to just stack up the negatives versus the positives. And personally, I think that you shouldn't totally avoid leasehold properties. And I say that as being someone who grew up with a parent that was always like, my mum was always like, oh, don't buy leasehold, don't buy leasehold, don't ever buy leasehold, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. My sister bought a leasehold property and I bought a leasehold property, and it worked for us. For her, she still has her flat and she has it as a buy-to-let property, and then she has her house, and so that flat is nicely funding some of her lifestyle. And with me, as you all know, I sold it, I made money on it, and then now I own a freehold house. And so would I say don't ever buy a leasehold property? No, of course not. How can I do that? That would be hypocritical, because I know it has worked for me and I know it has worked for other people that I know as well. So let's just talk about like the difference between them and like the pros and cons. So with a freehold property, you are the sole owner of the property and you can do what you like, really. Like, you own the bricks, you own the mortar, you own the windows, you own the chimney, you own the roof, you own the land that your property is sitting on, you own everything. And so you've got more of a free reign to do whatever you like. So if you want to put an extension on, you can put your extension on. If you want to go up into the attic and build a room up there, you can do that. You can put a garden room in the garden. Like, you can do pretty much what you like within the rules, because obviously there's still rules to follow. So like, if the council don't like a particular thing, they're not going to let you do that. So although you have freehold, like, I can't just, I don't know, put a space station in my garden because no one's going to let me. If I wanted to like run a cafe from my front room, again, I'm not going to be able to do that because it's a residential dwelling, and cafes and things have different class uses and things like that. So there's still rules you have to follow. Although it's your property and you can sort of do whatever you like, you still have to follow the rules. But the good thing is that you own it for an infinite amount of time. So if you're going to live till you're 1,000 years old, you can still live on your property. No one is going to say like, I need that property back. No one's going to kick you out or anything like that, so long as you pay your mortgage, of course. So yeah, so that's the main thing about freeholds, is that you have a bit more liberty to do what you like, and it's yours for forever, basically. But as I mentioned, there are downsides. You can't just do what you want, because there's things that are called like covenants and easements as well. So like, your property might be under a covenant whereby you have to grant like a right of access to someone, or you might have an easement on your land that allows you to get over someone else's land. So again, it's not, and I'll give you an example of my family home actually. I'll put a picture up to help describe what I'm saying. So my family home is the third house in from the end of the road, and in our gardens, at the back of the garden, there is a there's like almost like a driveway, if you like, and there's a gate to allow people vehicle access from that gate. And so because we need to be able to get access and drive our cars all the way down, our neighbours can't actually benefit from the full length of their garden, and because they have to allow us to go along that back path. And so like, we have an easement on our land that says you can cross over your neighbour's property, and then they have a covenant that says they have to allow us. And so like, they can't do anything with that land, and it has been a point of contention at times, because like, you want to get everything that you can for your money. Like, there's a whole, like, if you imagine the width of a car and a bit more, there's that whole space where they're not able to use their land because they simply have to give us the right of access. And so it's so yeah, there are still like rules and things in place that you have to follow even when you have freeholds, and those things will be written in the deeds and in all of the paperwork, and you'll understand that when you get your first property, you'll be able to read through it all. The main downside to having a freehold home is that the whole responsibility is yours as well of the property. So any financial burden is yours to bear alone pretty much. So if your house has a chimney on it that's not shared with a neighbour, if that chimney starts to collapse, you're going to have to find the money to fix it. No one's going to share that burden with you. You're not going to be able to, cut the costs in any way. It's just solely your burden. So I would say that that's really the only sort of downside to freeholds, but in the context of things, it's not a bad thing to have to deal with. So a leasehold property is different in that you don't own the land that the property is on. Okay, so these are usually for things like flats and maisonettes where there's multiple people living on one plot. So you don't own that land, and so you can't just do whatever you like, however you like, whenever you like. Okay, so usually you only own that property, and what you own is the interior. So you own the inside walls, you own the windows, I believe, and you own like anything that's inside you own. You're not responsible for the structure of the building. You can't make any changes to the structure. You're not responsible for the external parts of the building, so like the external walls and things like that. Any common areas as well, like where you have flats where there's like shared entry, all those access ways and those common areas, you're not responsible for them. You don't own them. You don't own the grounds either. And so that's the downside really to having a leasehold property, is that one, you're sharing your space, and two, you don't own any of it. So you can't just be like, oh, I'm going to paint my house blue today. Like, it's not going to work. You can't do that because you need to get permission from the person who actually owns the property as a whole. The other downside to a leasehold property is that you only own it for a certain number of years. So, for example, your lease might have 60 years on it. If you buy that when you're 30 years old, by the time you're 90, someone's going to be like, hey, you need to get out of here. Or you can choose to extend the lease at a cost, which is usually quite a high cost. It's not something that you would just casually have lying around in the bank. You have to make a proper plan to be able to save for extending a lease. So the thing that people don't like about buying a leasehold property as well is the charges that come with it, because sometimes those charges can actually be extortionate. So there's something called ground rent that you're going to have to pay if you have a leasehold property, and that's just like, it's usually a nominal fee that goes to whoever actually owns the land, so the freeholder. And like, for example, on my flat, that was £20 per year, which is like, it's nothing. It's like £1.70 something per month. So it's a really low charge. But where it can get a bit tricky is the service charges. So you have to pay a service charge for those common areas that you share with other flat owners. You have to pay towards their maintenance, and you have to pay towards any like exterior gardening or any like repair works and things like that. And so it can be quite tricky if you've got a management company that charges a lot of money, but it doesn't have to be that way. So again, for example, with the flat that I had, and I wish I had taken a copy of the lease so that I could show you properly, but it was actually written into that lease that they could only charge £20 for ground rent, and they could only charge £100 for service charge as well. So the management company can't just be like, oh, actually tomorrow I'm going to put your charges up because it's not enough money. Like, they can't do that because it was written into the lease. So if you've got something like that, and that was obviously on an older building, so maybe that's why it can't change. But sometimes with some of the newer properties, those companies charge extortionate amounts. I know that some people can be paying like £2,800. I think that's the average payment, is £2,800 for the whole year. And that is quite expensive. It's an additional cost on top of paying your mortgage, your council tax, your water, like all your different bills and things. So I can understand why there's such a negative connotation around them, but not all leases are the same and not all charges are the same. And so you have to do your research and find something like maybe similar to what I had, where the charges are really low and the charges aren't ever going to change. The other thing that you have to be mindful of, that you have to spend out for in a leasehold property, is the building insurance as well. You have to pay your share of that. And yeah, I know you're probably thinking, okay, but if you have a freehold home, you have to pay your insurance as well. But the difference is that, like, I have insurance on my house at the minute. If it was to expire tomorrow, I can be like, do you know what, I'm kind of hard up this month. I can't afford to pay for that. So I could put it off for a month or 2 months. Like, no one's going to come and find me because like I can do what I want, I own the home. But if it's a leasehold property, they will automatically renew it, and they will automatically be charging you for those fees as well. So you'd have to pay your share in that. So it's a bit more of a financial burden in that sense, because you can't then be like, actually, I want you to go with, I don't even know the names of companies, but you might think company A is cheaper, but then the management company is going to pick company B because that's what they're used to, or that's what they want to do, or what, for whatever reason, you can't pick and choose who your insurance provider will be. And so yeah, that's another negative of leaseholds. For me, on the flat that I had, the insurance every year was quite high, so it was like £340 or something around there. And that was because it was a period building, and so like when you get house insurance, they ask you what year was your property built in, what is it made of, how much it costs to rebuild it, this, that and the other. There's so many questions that you wouldn't even think that they ask about, but they need to know about the building, because if they have to then build it back, how much is it going to cost? So that was quite expensive just because of the nature of the buildings. It had sash windows and all the rest of it, so it was more costly. But usually costs won't be that high for insurance. That was kind of like a one-off. But even with that high payment though, when I add everything together, I was spending £500 per month on my charges. So £500 isn't a lot to ask. That is like, I haven't calculated it exactly, but that's like 40 something pounds per month. So on top of my mortgage payment, which was £370 to start off with, and then it went down to £290, like in the end I'm paying like less than £400 per month for like all of my like fees associated with being a homeowner. That's obviously not including bills and things. So that's not expensive. Like I've said in a previous video, I know a person who's paying £900 per month for rent. That is crazy. That's crazy. So would I prefer to buy a leasehold property or go and rent someone else's property for £900? I'm going to get myself a leasehold property because it's so much cheaper and I can make it work for me. I can make money on it, and then I can sell it when I'm ready. As I said before, you've got to weigh up pros and cons, and this information is going to be available to you before you even buy a property. So when you look at things on like Rightmove or any of those sort of search websites that I showed you in my previous video, you'll see on there that it says at the bottom, ground rent is this, service charge is this, or if it doesn't say that, you can call them up and you can ask them and they'll let you know over the phone whether it's even something you want to consider. And so you have to use that information that's freely available to you to make those choices and do those calculations and make sure that the numbers add up. So another downside to owning a leasehold property is that you might have like, you know, like when I mentioned earlier about the easements and the covenants, like you've got a similar sort of thing on your lease as well. And then you've got like other ridiculous rules that you might have to follow. So for example, in my old lease, it said that I needed to like paint the walls every like 6 years or every 7 years or something like that. So like there's certain things that you'll have to do. It said something about pets as well, like you couldn't have pets, or like, yeah, something like that. It might say that in your lease that you can't have pets, or you can't have certain types of things in there. Or it can like list like where you should park your car. So for example, again at the flat, there were 5 flats but only 4 parking spaces, and so it like outlined which flat had which space, and so like I had a particular spot that I was supposed to park my car in. There were a few things in there that were a bit outdated because this property was built in like the 1900s. It was Victorian, and so it said something like a particular area in the garden had to be used for what, like hanging clothes or like washing clothes, and that was the only thing it was supposed to be used for, or something like that. Like no one used that area for hanging their clothes, like everyone just did their own thing. And in fact my neighbour parked her car there, so she just did what she wanted. But yeah, just things like that that are going to be in the lease, that are rules that you have to follow, or things that you can't do, and so on. So when you have a leasehold property, you can't make any structural changes because the structure of the building belongs to the leaseholder. You can ask for permission, and if they want to say yes, they can say yes. But again, if they want to say no on that one, they can. But for other general things that are going to be sensible, like changes, they're not supposed to say no. And like things like renovation work, so if you want to put a new kitchen in, a new bathroom, you can do that. If you want to start moving where like waste pipes and things like that are, I think you would have to get permission for. Or if you wanted to like maybe put up like a wall here or there to like separate spaces, maybe that's something that you could ask for permission for as well. But yeah, it just really depends on what it is that you want to do. Some things are covered and you can just do them, and some things you have to ask permission for. So yeah, so that's another downside, is that you can't make structural changes. Okay, so the real trouble with leasehold properties is the number of years that are left on the lease. And so as someone who's buying a property, you need to make sure that you understand how many years are left on the lease and what the implications of buying that lease are going to be in the next few years. And then as an owner of a leasehold property, once you own it, you need to keep a mental check on how many years are left on it so that you don't allow it to fall too low. And the reason why is because properties that have a low lease can become unmortgageable. And the reason they become unmortgageable is because banks will only lend money on it if the length of the lease extends about 25, 30 years or so past the length of your mortgage term. So, for example, if I go to the bank and I get a 30-year mortgage, then my leasehold property needs to have at least 55 years left on that lease. So 30-year mortgage, 25 years past the length of that, I need to look for something that's 55-year lease. So for example, in my previous video, I was looking on Rightmove, I think it was, and I showed you a property that had a low lease. That lease was 43 years on it. And so I wouldn't be able to get that. I couldn't go to the bank and be like, yes, can I have a mortgage on this property? They won't lend it to me because it doesn't have enough years. And that's why you will see lots of properties that are cash buyers only, and that's because the lease sometimes is too low, or sometimes it's to do with the construction of the building as to why the banks won't lend money on it. So you can get 999-year leases on properties, which is brilliant. If you see something like that, it's totally fine. You don't have to worry about it. And in your lifetime, you probably won't have to worry about it as well. But if you see something that's like lower, so like 90 is probably just about okay to get. If it's below that, then it's going to be a bit of a problem, because the issue is that you have to own a leasehold property for 2 years before you can qualify to extend that lease. So although you might buy a property that has like 90 years left on it, in 2 years' time, it's going to have 88 years left on it. And so in 2 years' time, it's going to be a little bit more expensive to renew that lease, because there's a calculation that they do, and it's about the charges on it. So the ground rent comes into the calculation, and the length of years remaining comes into the calculation as well. And then also it's about the value of the property as well. So depending on what the numbers are is depending on what the price is going to be. So the lower the number of years on the lease, the higher the cost of renewing it. So it's something you've got to keep your eye on. But like I said, if something's comfortably in the 90s, in the hundreds, or 999 years, you've not got too much to worry about, so long as, like for me, I knew that I was going to be out of that property in a short amount of time. There was 90 something years left on that lease when I bought it, and then the person who bought it off of me, I think it was either 89 or 90 years left on it, and so he needed to own it for 2 years before he can then renew the lease, and he was okay with doing that. He did want me to start the process of lease extension off, but when I spoke about it with my solicitors, it just didn't make sense to go through that whole process, because 2 years' time was still kind of comfortable enough for him to be able to extend it after owning the home for 2 years. So I didn't start that process for him, but you can make that a condition of your sale. So if you see something that has a low lease on it and you really want that property because you think it's going to be a good investment, in your before you exchange, you can make it as a condition of sale. So you can say, I will only buy this if you start that process of lease extension for me, so that I don't have to wait 2 years for the property and then it becomes like unmortgageable. So there's different ways around it. So again, you have to know your stuff, and you have to take advice, and you have to do your calculations properly. So it's not that you shouldn't buy that property, it's that maybe you can buy it and get the lease renewal at the same time to make a better investment for yourself. So a step up from having a leasehold property would be to find something that has a share of the freehold. And the real benefit of that is that you can just grant yourself a 999-year lease if you want to. So you don't have to worry about things like that. Also, it means that you might have more control over like the service charges and things like that. Obviously ground rent, you are the freeholder, so there's no ground rent as such. And so it's a little bit better. It's not amazing still, like you can't just extend and sort of like improve your house or your home, your flat freely, because especially if you're in like a block of flats, like there's a limit to what you can do. So it's like it gives you some freedom but not total freedom. So yeah. So if you own a leasehold currently, you can actually look into getting a share of freehold on your property, and there are certain rules around it, like you have to make sure that other people agree and things like that, but you can look into that yourself. And again, that will be beneficial because you can grant yourself a nice long lease, and you can have more free reign as well. I would say it's less beneficial to do it on buildings that are like a block of flats. Like if you've got a maisonette, which is like an up and down house, then that might be a good idea to get the share of the freehold on that, because then maybe you have more like leeway to like extend and do other improvements and things. But you know, you're always going to be dependent on the other people as well. If you're in a block of flats, the roof belongs to everyone, the walls belong to everyone, and so it's still not as free as freehold. So yeah, also you can just buy freeholds by themselves. So if you want to buy the freehold for a building, then you can do that, and then the ownership of those buildings would then come to you after a while, or you can charge people for extending their leases and things, so you can make money off of just having freeholds. So another like alternative to leasehold is something called common hold, which is less common, but it's a similar thing. So you own the inside of your flat or whatever, and it's yours for any length of time. So there's no like 90 years, 100 years, whatever on it. It's yours, and then you share the responsibility of the common areas as well. So like all of the maintenance for the common areas, the exterior and things like that. So it's similar but not, there's not an amount of time on it. So when I'm talking about leaseholds and freeholds, I like to put in like an extra category, if you like. So when you think about new build houses, if you were to buy a new build house, it would be freehold, but you would have to pay service charges. And the reason why is that with like older buildings, the council will maintain the roads, they'll maintain the parks and all the open areas and everything like that. But when you have a new build area, the council don't want any responsibility for that development. They don't want to maintain the roads, they don't want to maintain the open spaces, they don't want to maintain the parks and things. And so someone's got to take care of it. And so what they do then is charge a service charge, and then a management company will be responsible for maintaining all of those things. It's a bit unfair, I think, because at the end of the day, they don't get out of paying their council tax. They still have to pay council tax for things like bins and the police and adult social care and things like that. So it's like they're doubly charged. And the other thing is, it can become a point of contention as well, because on those developments, they obviously have lots of open areas and like playgrounds and things. And so the people who are paying for it, who live there, will use those playgrounds. But there's nothing to stop someone just wandering off from the other areas of town and coming in and using their playgrounds. And yeah, it can be a bit of a sore spot. Like, it's like, hang on a minute, I'm paying for the maintenance of this and your child is here. Like, there have been a few cases like that, but it is what it is. If you are going to buy a new build house, you have to pay a service charge. So the problem with service charge is not just for new builds but for older buildings as well, is that the management companies can change. And so if like a management company changes and they're like, oh, we're doubling the fee, like, you will have to find that extra money. You have nothing to say about it. Like, and that's going to affect your finances. So where you thought you were paying £1,000, you're now paying £2,000 per year for that. So you have to allow for those costs. You can't get out of it. And that can also have an impact on the sellability of your home. And so like when you buy a house, more than likely the value of it is going to rise. So someone who's buying that home is now going to have to pay extra in mortgage because the cost of the house has gone up. Plus they have to pay for extra service charges. So per month or per year, that house is no longer affordable for them. So there's been quite a few people who have struggled to sell their new build homes onto another buyer because the service charges were just ridiculous and people couldn't afford it. So that's something to be aware of as a cost as well. So, you know, there's pros and cons of all of the different options, and you just have to weigh it up and see what's best for you. Actually, it's not just new builds that have service charges as well. Like, I don't know if you've seen any of those areas where like you have homes like all sort of like on an estate, and then there's like a shared swimming pool or a shared gym or something like that. Like, those houses will have service charges on them as well to sort of pay for the maintenance of the pools and the gyms and the like leisure facilities that are there as well. So yeah, pros and cons of everything. But what I will say in summary is that don't just listen to people who say, never get a leasehold, never get a leasehold, blah, 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 blah. That's all well and good. Do your homework, do the calculations, read the terms, have a look at the lease. All of this information is going to be available to you before you exchange contracts. So you can put an offer in on a home just so that you get it. And then if you look in the lease and you see actually like it's maybe not stacking up quite right and you can't do what you thought you could do on it, then you can say, sorry, no, I'm pulling out of this sale. This isn't for me. So you don't have to commit to it until you have all of the information. So look at the number of years left on the lease. You look at the service charges, the ground rent, all of those additional costs, and weigh it up and see whether it's a good financial investment for you. Don't just discount it just because it's leasehold. You've just seen a title on there. Like it could be leasehold with 999 years and a £20 ground rent and a 10p service charge for all you know. Like obviously those numbers are ridiculous, but I'm just illustrating a point there. But yeah, you have to look into things, you have to read into things, and you have to make a sensible, informed, calculated decision. Okay, I'm looking a bit more casual because I've just been in the garden doing some gardening, but I realised that I had forgotten to say something that was really important to say in terms of this video, and that's that when you find a property, if it's a leasehold property, when you do that final mortgage application process with your bank, they are going to ask you for the figures that are associated with that property that you found. So they're going to ask you how much the service charge is, they're going to ask you how much the ground rent is, and they are going to use that to check your affordability. So when you get paid per month, can you afford the mortgage charge plus the service charge plus the ground rent plus anything else that you have to pay? Those are going to be included in that calculation. So if your service charge is like extortionate amounts, like I said before in the video that the average service charge is like £2,800, that might be just too much for your budget if you find a property that has that service charge on it. So but whereas you might be able to afford something like my property that only had £100 on it. So you need to make sure that if you're on a tight budget, you're looking for something that has as minimal charges as possible so that it doesn't affect your affordability. Okay, the other thing I forgot to do when I was recording this video is I forgot to do an outro. And so if you liked this video, give me a like. And actually, if you learned something this video, even if it's just one thing that you learned that you didn't know before, can you give the video a like, please? And that will help me to understand like whether the content was useful for you. And if you want to chat in the comments, then put your comments down below, that's fine. If you want to send me a message on Instagram, you can as well. I'm happy to talk about property over there as well. And so yeah, in the meantime, until the next video, take care of yourself and stay safe.